please forgive me for speaking in English, although it's not my native language.
Very German, and maybe that has some relevance to gender studies. But anyway, I was told that this presentation should be in English, so my whole presentation is in English, PowerPoint and talk included. Are we ready? So I'm going to compare. Oh, you're going too far here?
Yep.
Thank you. Compare.
Warriors, published in 1990, by the way, with Alexandre Moyava-Attaz, Taute, published in 2011. In a while. Thank you. Why did I make this comparison? Because I've been teaching Once the Warriors for a while to the English major students, and they always come up with these observations that there are
what is described in this novel and Tahiti. But because I'm a literary person, I wanted to base these comparisons on literary works. My purpose today is to highlight that both novels are showcases in oceanic self-alteration. What is self-alteration? It's seeing oneself through the eyes of an oppressive outsider and integrating that image so completely that it becomes self-representation. In Duff's and Atta's novels, Maori male warriors and Tahitian highly sexualized vahine are stereotypes imposed by Western discourses. But they have been so deeply integrated that Maori and Tahitians actively identified themselves to these stereotypes. In order to demonstrate this point, I'll alternate between both novels. I'll first look at their representations of warriors and vahine, then confront these representations to history to demonstrate that they are constructions that have been appropriated by Maori and Tahitian authors as self-representations. Let's start with Duff. Alan Duff's Once Were Warriors hugely promoted the representation of the Maori as warriors. Witness this first passage. We used to be a race of warriors. We used to war all the time, us Maoris against each other, tribe against tribe, savages. But warriors, eh? It's very important to remember that. Warriors. Here is a description of a 20th century haka. Words exploded forth, kamate, kamate, each line a spit-laced outpouring of war, war. It was a beautiful, crazy war dance, like they were risen from a swamp, a primeval swamp. We can see that the representations of Maori warriors, past and present, stress their savage and primitive features. Let's switch to Atta's novel and the vahine. Taute is a half Paumotu, half Chinese young woman who was born and raised in Papeete, Tahiti. She goes bare-breasted most of the time and is deliberately extremely active sexually, as you can see. She would indulge in harvests selected upon ogling at the varying promises that the boys' wet shorts suggested. She would pounce on them unreservedly, grabbing at clumsy partners with unrivaled expertise. Her fantasies were always at the ready. She was obsessed with orgasm. Everyone around her likewise seems to spend their time having sex. You come at the right time. Here is how she views her fellow Tahitians. She wondered if so many easy acquiescences to sex might not be quite simply an island feature. So the question arises, are these really Maori and Tahitian features? Are these fictional representations of Maori and Tahitians based on history? The answer is no. The Maori did not war much, simply because they couldn't afford to. Men had to contribute to the daily needs of the community, go hunting and fishing and growing crops and procreating. War could not be waged continually, contrary to what the novel claims. Archaeological findings do not substantiate the warring culture. They find few war wounds and weapons. The Maori had developed alternative ways of measuring up to their rivals. Haka was more a way to deter than to provoke the enemy. Utu meant reciprocity, not only in war, but also in generosity. Overcoming one's rival with generous gifts could be severely humiliating if the gifts could not be reciprocated. Wars were therefore only occasional, and Maori wars became deadliest after the Europeans and Americans had introduced muskets. How about Tahiti? Tahitian women were not licentious. Witness James Morrison in 1792. The Tahitian ladies who act in licentious ways are not to be taken as a standard for the whole, no more than the nymphs of the Thames are to be taken as samples of our fair country women. So the only Tahitian women who had easy sex with the sailors behaved just like the prostitutes in the harbors of England. They were not the rule. What we have here are myths. The myth of the Maori warrior, the myth of the highly sexualized vahine. Myths, as defined by Barth, a cultural stereotype that negates all historical situations. The next question is, why this myth-making? Where does it originate from? European explorers were the first to spread news about fierce Maori warriors, but the Maori themselves were quick to confirm this news. I want to stress here the Maori agency at the start. Maori self-alteration was part of the Maori strategy to draw benefits from the Europeans. Let me explain this. When the first Europeans visited a tribe or iwi, at that time, they brought the iwi increased mana, as well as material goods. The Maori noticed that the Europeans were horrified at cannibalism, so they would describe their Maori neighbors as cannibal warriors in order to keep a monopoly on their visitors. The same agency may be observed in Tahiti. Dame Anne Thalmann and Serge Cherkessov have demonstrated that offering maidens was a case of self-alteration as Tahitian agency. After Wallis's visit had caused the deaths of so many Tahitians, the Tahitians decided to assuage their next visitors by offering maidens, and through them, draw benefits to themselves and increase their own mana. But to the Europeans, this started the myth of the highly sexualized vahine. And with time, each of these processes of self-alteration gradually got dominated by Western powers. Let's get back to Once Were Warriors and see what a Maori chief has to say to his 20th century Maori audience. He told them of great acts of chivalry during the warring with the first white men, that's Maori warriors, slipping out into the battlefield at night to tend to the wounded enemy, giving the enemy food and drink so the enemy might have more strength to continue the battle in the morning. Historians point out that this tale is part of New Zealand legendary stock. It's a common feature in the history of the British Empire. The British praise the value of their defeated opponents only to increase their own military prestige. This kind of tale only started once the British had defeated the Maori. Then the British Army and the Pakeha settlers exaggerated the strength of the resistance they had overcome. They encouraged tales of a Maori land full of chivalrous warriors who were no longer. So Maori land became some sort of fairyland. Promoting the concept of Maori warriors also justified the colonial powers, which acted as a safeguard against allegedly violent Maori. Maori physical valor was also a way to contain the Maori into physical work. In the 20th century, the Maori were strongly encouraged to contribute to the country's economic development as manual labor force. Maori warriors also helped to account for the overrepresentation of Maori in prisons. Lately, Maori warriors have been exploited through shows, haka, rugby games. It's a new way of having Maori warriors contribute to the country's economic development through the tourist industry. Let's now observe Tahitian self-alteration. The Tahitian female body has been appropriated into the tourist industry. Tourism strongly promotes the sensual vahine. But as Te Aiwa demonstrates, tourism in Oceania is often militarism. Militarism is the conjunction of the military and the tourist industries. Here is the definition Te Aiwa gives. Military force ensures the smooth running of a tourist industry, and that same tourist industry masks the military force behind it. The paradox with Atta's novel is that it is against militarism. It clearly denounces the association between the military nuclear tests in Tahiti and tourism. A vision of amazing prosperity was fermenting under the mushroom cloud. The military airport was to have thoroughly beneficial fallouts, tourists. It is a paradox because although Atta's novel definitely opposes militarism, yet through its representation of the Tahitian vahine, it also obliquely promotes militarism. His representation of the Tahitian vahine somehow encourages militarism. My suggestion of an explanation for this paradox is self-alteration. The myth of the vahine has become part and parcel of Tahitian self-identification. To conclude, through history, we may note similar processes of self-alteration in Aotearoa and in Tahiti, which start with oceanic agency and continue into fairy lands. The process of self-alteration dominated by the West may be observed in both novels. I will end with a quote from Edward Said. My hope is to illustrate the formidable structure of colonial domination and, for Oceanians, the dangers and temptations of employing this structure upon themselves. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's a great way to conclude. It brings together so many other points made earlier.